One. And welcome to a special edition of Full Stop here with Mark Preston. This is kind of an interesting show that we're going to do this weekend. I'm actually surrounded by people that I went to college with, that went to college in preceding years and post years. This is part of a new program that the University of Massachusetts at Amherst is doing in Washington, D.C. We're kicking it off with this political panel to talk about the future, what we're going to see in 2018, talk about the first year of President Trump's time in office. Of course, this weekend is his anniversary of being sworn in, and we'll talk a little bit about the 2018 midterm elections. But to do so, we have to have people who know what they're talking about. And of course, as you all know, I don't necessarily know what I'm talking about. So I am surrounded by some folks here that could be very helpful. First of all, Congressman Ron Klink. He was first elected to the United States Congress in 1992. He served 4 consecutive terms representing the 4th Congressional District of Pennsylvania. Now the congressman is a senior policy advisor at Nelson Mullins Riley in Scarborough here in Washington, D.C., and he is hosting us tonight. Brian Jones is a graduate of the University of Massachusetts as well. He has worked on numerous campaigns as well as hold very senior roles within the Republican Party. Some of the people he's worked for presidential campaigns has been President George W. Bush, Senator John McCain, Governor Mitt Romney, and Governor Christie. He was once described as the top free agent GOP operative by the Washington Post, which we all know is fake news. I'm only kidding. I'm only kidding out there. And Stefan Hankin, he is the founder and president of Lincoln Park Strategies. And you're wondering, what's Lincoln Park Strategies? Well, Lincoln Park Strategies is a polling firm. They do some general consulting work with candidates. He got his start coming here to Washington, D.C. as well when he graduated college. He has worked for the likes of the Peter D. Hart Research Company, Widmeyer Communications, and he was part of the polling team that helped Barack Obama become the 44th president of the United States. He has gone on to lead research projects not only here in the United States, but in 25 countries around the world. So thanks to everyone for coming here tonight. So, gentlemen, there's quite a lot to talk about. I don't know if we have enough time on this program, let alone in the next couple of years, to try to dissect and understand what has been going on. But let's just, Congressman, let's start off with you when we're talking about the government shutdown. The fact of the matter is a deal will be cut eventually somehow. But why are we in this situation right now? The fiscal year for the federal government starts on October 1st. We are now near the end of January, and Congress still can't figure out its budget.
We've gone through a prolonged period of time. In fact, it's much more unusual for Congress to have a budget in the last however many years than to not have one. And so we go with continuing resolutions, which means the government continues to spend based on the last budget that they worked off of, and that's really not an efficient way to run government. And those continuing resolutions that keep the government running are of varying lengths, right, depending on what the members of Congress decide. And so we're actually faced as we meet here now. This is prior to when people will be hearing us on the air with a deadline where Congress has to decide now. And we understand that they're trying to figure out a way to fund government, not for the rest of the fiscal year, but really for one more month. So we'll be back here again February 16th trying to figure out if we can either have a budget and have appropriations bills done, or whether we have a series of continuing resolutions to figure out how to fund the government.
Yeah, and you know, when the blame gets thrown around, is it the Republicans' fault? Is it the Democrats' fault? We should say, and I don't have the specific numbers right in front of me, but we should say that the American public's perception of Congress is in the teens, is my guess. The approval rating is probably, well, Stefan, I mean, you would know that, right, as a pollster?
Yeah, I think John McCain said it the best, that we're down to family members and close friends that actually think we're doing a good job, and that's about it. But yeah, we're dealing with about teens in most places.
Wow. So the question is the blame game then. And Brian, let me start with you. Republicans control the House of Representatives. They control the Senate. And, of course, they control the White House. However, what a lot of people don't quite understand, or at least act as if they don't understand is that there are disparate factions within each political party. So when you look at the House Republicans, for instance, you have social conservatives, you have centrists, you have moderates, you have all different kinds of folks who are not always on the same page. And is that kind of what we've seen so far, specifically when we're dealing with trying to fund the government?
Yeah, and I think you raise a good point, and it's not just it's you have these different factions. You've got conservatives, you've got centrists, but you've also got a White House now too that is complicating things, I think, to a certain extent for Republicans. And you have the party is very much in a state of flux. I think trying to figure out who it is, what direction it's going in. As someone who worked here going back and the early 2000s, I think there was a lot more unity. I mean, certainly you had those factions then, and the congressman could probably speak to that from the other side. But right now, you really have people trying to figure out what direction the party is going to head in. And again, the White House is certainly making things more complicated.
And Stefan, when you look at the Democratic side as well, let's look at the United States Senate. First of all, when you look at the United States Senate, of course, Republicans control it. Democrats have an incredible amount of power, although some of that has been weakened over the past decade or so. However, when you're talking about trying to fund the government, you have the likes of Joe Manchin from West Virginia, perhaps Heidi Heitkamp of North Dakota. These are folks, Claire McCaskill from Missouri, these are folks who are up for re-election in 2018. And if they don't fund the federal government, that automatically gets turned into a campaign commercial against them.
No, exactly. And then you also have Senator Durbin from Illinois, who, as a matter of policy, says he won't vote for ever shutting down the government. So, the interesting thing is just the interplay in the House with all these different factions, and God bless Paul Ryan for having to volunteering to deal with all this. And the Republicans also have the Hastert rule, which is that we have to pass this with Republicans. I mean, I think if they could pull together from both sides and make that the voting block, it would be relatively easy to get these things through, because I think there are enough moderates on both sides to keep the government up and running. But in the Senate, I mean, if it gets to the House and it goes to the Senate, I can't imagine a deal won't be struck. Although, it seems to be coming from the White House more than anything, that they seem to be trying to make it easier and easier for Democrats in tough seats to be able to vote against these things. So, the big question is, what are they going to do with DACA, with the deferred action for kids who are brought here illegally, and so in general, they've we're going to put it in the next one, we're going to put it in the next one, but it hasn't really been brought to a point, and now the White House in the last week seems to be saying, okay, we're going to actually make this a big issue and make this harder and harder, or, I mean, I guess it depends on which direction you're looking at this, either harder or easier for Joe Manchin, Heidi Heitkamp to say, all right, I can't vote for this anymore. Like, this is just insane. And I think, one thing I will give Republicans full credit for is they made it incredibly easy for Manchin, Heitkamp, McCaskill, Donnelly to stay with the Democrats on all these votes on healthcare, taxes. I mean, it would not have been that hard to put these senators in a really tough position, but the way that they came out of the gate, it was all of a sudden, it was like, wow, it's easy for me to not make that vote, and it's making my job easier. I mean, it doesn't mean their election is going to be easier, but at least the internal politics in the Senate has been made easier for them decision-wise. And
you're listening to a special edition of A Full Stop here on SiriusXM POTUS 124. A special edition because this is, in many ways, a coming home for myself and several of the other panelists that are sitting next to me as we're talking about what's going to happen in 2018 and as we move forward. This is brought to you by the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. Have to give that plug, my old school at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. So as we're looking at 2018, Brian, I want to give you some numbers, and by no means is this a pile-on, but fact is you're the Republican on the panel, so in many ways you have to answer for all the ills of the Republican Party in the White House.
Congratulations.
Congratulations, Brian. So there was a new poll that came out this week by Quinnipiac University that showed that President Trump's approval rating was at 38%, 57% disapprove of how he is running the country. But there's a couple more numbers that jumped out. 88% of black voters and 68% of Hispanic voters say that President Trump does not respect people of color as much as he respects white people. And then among Caucasians, 53% say he doesn't respect people of color as much as whites. So as you're marinating over those numbers, let's just look back at the past year, the promises that were made, and promises are made all the time, promises that were not kept, or were not come to fruition, and what can they do to get beyond it? Brian, answer all those questions.
Wow,
now.
that's quite a lot. Well, first off, I don't think they're marinating those numbers. I think they're drowning in those numbers. I mean, this is a real problem, I think, for the party right now. And the challenging thing for Trump, too, is think about the fact that we have low unemployment. The economy is doing well. By many accounts, the war in the Middle East is being prosecuted at a more effective level. I mean, if things ever started going poorly, it's hard to imagine where his numbers would go. I think among people in town that I deal with, there's a lot of concern over the midterms, and there's almost a universal acceptance now that it could really be a tough midterm. I remember working at the RNC in 2005 and 2006, and we sat there and looked at all these competitive races and said, we can't lose all these, can we? And we basically did. So, and that was in a climate that was bad, but I don't think as bad as this one. And
right.
As you know, Mark, with President Trump, there's that X factor on any given day. I mean, in 2017, the White House kind of ended up a little bit with the tax
right.
bill passing, come right back, and all of a sudden, it's just been 2 weeks of answering questions over things they don't really want to be talking about.
Congressman, off of what Brian said as well, Congressman Klink, if you look at the economy right now, it's booming. It is booming, and you look at President Trump's approval rating at 38%. I mean, you would think that his approval rating would be 83%. Given the fact that unemployment's so low, people are they have jobs, and of course the tax cut, very controversial tax cut. I understand that, but people are seeing some return on it right now. How does the president turn it around?
Well, he doesn't take my advice. First of all, I'm
going to get you his number.
He does. He does. I think first of all, the most important thing that I would recommend is to throw his telephone away. Stop tweeting. Start governing. Start acting presidential. Start really communicating. There are a lot of good members of Congress in both the House and Senate who are in Republican rank and file and Republican leadership, and there are a lot of good Democrats that in the rank and file and in leadership. Figure out what you want to do. It varies from moment to moment what this president wants to do. I mean, if you remember last Tuesday, he had this I'd never seen anything like it before. I had a group of bipartisan legislators over to the White House, said we're gonna fix this DACA thing. He talked about his Lindsey Graham was quoted yesterday in a hearing saying he wanted to do it with love. Yesterday at 10 o'clock, again, we're taped, so this was a little earlier in the week, but at 10 o'clock in the morning, Senator Dick Durbin said, I just called Lindsey Graham and said, I had the best conversation I've ever had with the president. Mm-hmm. And Lindsey Graham called over the White House and said, let's go over right away. And by the time they got there 2 hours later, the president had completely changed his mind. That's driving Mitch McConnell crazy. It's driving Speaker Ryan crazy. It's driving their entire leadership crazy. So he's got to have some consistency and stop treating the presidency as though it's a television program, and start treating it as though he really won the presidency and start acting presidential.
Stefan, when you're talking to potential candidates who are looking to run, and we'll talk about the record-breaking number of women who are going to run or are looking at running or likely to run. But when you're talking just to the average Democrat now who is looking at Washington, what is your advice to them about how to run their campaign?
Well, what my advice is, and what people tend to do, seems to not always be the same thing, unfortunately. I mean, so I'm kind of like a cold water Democrat, I guess I'll call it. So I'm clearly the landscape is shaping up nicely for a good night. But when we look at it, we're saying look, a lot of these districts are really bad districts. Like, these are not friendly territory. And the biggest group that is shifting right now are college-educated white voters. We saw in Virginia, it was a 6-point shift from not voting for Clinton to voting for Northam, who's now the Democratic governor of Virginia. And people of color voted at the same percentage. There was an increase in turnout, and those are going to be the two keys. But if you look at Virginia, and if Virginia is a bellwether for what's going to happen, where the shifts were in suburban, the suburbs of Washington D.C., the suburbs of Richmond, and then down in Tidewater, which tended to have more to do with minority vote than anything else. But really, the only district that's really affected by the shift is the 10th district, which is Barbara Comstock, who was in trouble to begin with. And, so I think right now that we've had a couple more retirement announcements, I think Comstock's probably like number one, like gonna lose on top of the list. But she was already up there, right? So these things aren't shifting. And none of the other Virginia seats, based on the results from the governor's race, seem to be moving dramatically towards the Democratic candidate. So we're a little bit more on the wet blanket side of things. But what I would like to see from Democrats,
kind of like a UMass guy, right?
Yeah,
I mean, always negative,
it's
classes always
Yep,
empty.
It's it's the weather, it's the long walks across campus. Although apparently it's much nicer now, coddling these kids. But so what I'd like to see Democrats, and what I do not think we will actually do, is Democrats need to project a positive vision of what we are as a party, what we stand for, and where we see this country going. We're not going to win over these skeptical voters with more of the same, or just doing Trump is terrible. Like, we know Trump is terrible. Like, 38% favorability, right? Like, Trump, no one is going to be running on I'm with Trump in the general election. But people are already there. We don't have to prove that point, but we've been trying to prove, quote unquote, prove how terrible Republicans are since, I don't know, 2006. It's all we talk about. Republicans are terrible. And the Republican favorability rating is down in the low teens, and Democrats are in the low 20s. So we have a better F. Go us. So I would like to see us putting a positive vision. This is where we think things should be. This is where we see us in the 21st century. What I'm afraid that we're going to do is just talk about how terrible Trump is and how terrible Republicans are, and we'll have an okay night, maybe enough to win back the House. I still don't think we win back the Senate, but I could be proven wrong.
Well, there are a lot of Democrats across America right now. Even though the issue this past week has been surrounding DACA, there really are a lot of Democrats in suburban and rural districts that want to run. They don't want to see a government shutdown to hinge on DACA, because that doesn't play in their district. It's an important issue, and we all feel, Republicans and Democrats feel strongly, it's injustice to these children. They were children who were brought here, and they've been good citizens. But that's not an issue that a lot of Democrats across America feel comfortable with hanging their hat on and wanting to close the government down. Yet their leadership seems to want to go that direction.
And you're listening to Full Stop with Mark Preston here on Sirius XM POTUS 124, a very special full stop here at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. We're not actually in Amherst. We're in Washington, D.C., surrounded by UMass alumni as well as panelists who attended as well, Washington insiders who fully understand the Washington landscape and still choose to live here in the so-called swamp. But let's talk about issues. And Brian, I think Stefan alluded to it. For candidates to win, as a consultant, as a political consultant, you want your candidates to talk about issues, right? I mean, in many ways. One of them, where there could be bipartisan support, has to do with infrastructure. And this question comes from the audience. How do you see Trump's infrastructure plan unfold?
Well, first off, I would say that issues do matter, but in many campaigns, to figure out what issues we're really going to focus on, we talk to someone like Stefan here,
yep,
and obviously rely on some level of survey research. Infrastructure is interesting, and I'd be curious to see what the congressman thinks about this. I mean, I'm personally a little surprised that this has not unfolded a little quicker. I mean, on some level, it does seem like an issue that would have bipartisan support. Unions would be behind it. Certainly, there's a need for infrastructure when you look at our roads, railways, really decaying infrastructure around the country. So you have jobs, you have industries who will need it. I'm surprised it wasn't really one of the first things out of the gate when the president came into office. And I think had he done that out of the gate, that would have sent a much different signal and really looked to unify and maybe get some of those congressional ratings up a little bit, showing that there's actual progress being made.
It was such a mistake, right, to come out and do healthcare.
Oh, I mean, the fact that they didn't start with the infrastructure was like just mind-boggling. Right. Because I mean, they could have come in, started with infrastructure, that would have passed in a heartbeat, and then they could have gone in and they should have sat down with Heitkamp and Manchin and Donnelly and been like, you know, we need to get rid of Obamacare. What can you vote for? Right? But just put them in that spot and then just go in, in that way. But if they had gotten that first win, it would have changed the entire dynamic. But instead, but I think this speaks to how bad Washington actually is. Like, I mean, it was Farm Bill, Transportation Bill. Those were like the layups, the gimmies. Like you could pass these things in a heartbeat, and we can't even do that now. And I mean, it just I think speaks volumes of where we are now compared to when the congressman was.
Hey, Congressman, let me ask you: if this was January, gosh, I don't even know what day it is or what year it is. If this was January 2017, okay, and you were still in Congress, and President Trump said, "I want to do infrastructure first," how
Sign me up.
Right,
Sign
jobs.
Me up. Jobs. There are no partisan bridges, highways, water projects, sewer projects, broadband projects. They're not partisan. And the other thing, which I was happy to see the president come out for, and other members are starting to make the comments too, you got to bring back earmarks. Have it all transparent. The members have to stand up. They have to put their name on it and be responsible for it. But that is the only way that members are able to actually go back to their constituents and go back to the states and say, we were able to be successful. We brought back the big dig, and we changed the city of Boston because of that project, or we brought this water project, or jobs are going to be able to stay in these small rural communities because we've got broadband there. The businesses don't have to move as their need for internet rises, which happens now. So look, we always did very, very well in a bipartisan fashion on infrastructure, but the president unfortunately was so fixated on getting rid of what Obama had done more so than setting up his own agenda for success. And he backed into it instead of running forward.
And you are listening to Full Stop with Mark Preston on Sirius XM POTUS 124. Very special edition. This is being hosted by the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. Stay with us. Much, much more of the program ahead, including what happens with higher education, what happens with cybersecurity, many, many questions on the table. So stay with us. We'll be right back. Okay. And welcome back to Full Stop with Mark Preston here on Sirius XM 124. We are talking to an esteemed panel, including former Congressman Ron Klink, Stefan Hankin, who's the founder and president of Lincoln Park Strategies, and Brian Jones, who is a partner in the BlackRock Group. Basically, everyone here sitting next to me are political practitioners here in Washington. Brian represents the Republican side, and Congressman Klink and Stefan represent the Democratic side, so to speak, when we're answering some of these questions. But let's just get right back to the audience questions. There's a question that came in that says, where do you see higher education policy going? What changes, what impact could we see in the coming year? Stefan, let me pass that off to you.
So in the full disclosure, we do work in the higher ed space, especially for private institutions, the National Association of Private Institutions, NICU. Anyways, just throwing that out there. But so what I find troubling in what's happening when it comes to higher education is that the conversation is moved from just, is it affordable, or how can we bring the price down? How can we increase access to higher ed? We seem to be having a conversation now about, is higher ed even worth it anymore? And
whoa, those are tough words in front of this crowd.
Yeah, I mean, I personally, I find it like absolutely ridiculous, and I'm not saying that everyone has to or should go to college, but we're somehow stepping away from the ideal of, this is how the next generation improves over the current generation, that we're increasing access to education, we're creating more opportunities for the next generation. And the data is clear that education is the way that you do that. So on the Republican side, we have this sort of demonizing of the quote unquote elites, and then a lot of that is through college. Now, personally, I find it a little funny, might not be the right word, but you have Ivy League educated Republicans talking about how ridiculous college is while their kids are attending the same schools, right? I mean, it's a tool. They're using it in campaigns to demonize the liberal elites on the coast, which I think ultimately is a bad line of argument for the country. Now, on the flip side, you have the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party talking about free college, which I think is an equally ridiculous argument, because it sounds good in a campaign. It's a great soundbite, but no one actually has a plan on how you would do this. And then they talk about, Sweden and Germany and France, and look, they have free access, and that is true-ish. Usually there are little fees and things like that, but all of these countries have tracked education systems, at age 10, 12, they're saying, okay, you people are going to be on the track and you get to go to college, and if you make it through, we're going to provide that college for free. You 80%, 70%, whatever, depending on the country, are not, and you're going to do a different track system. So, it's not just college for everyone, but we're in the age of everything's a soundbite, everything's a campaign promise. So we're dealing with, it's either free college for everyone or college is terrible, and anyone who sends their kid there is a Volvo driving, latte sipping, whatever else we are, elitist. And again, neither of these arguments are, I think, actually productive or good for the country.
Brian, let me throw this question at you. And really, if you can speak to it from your discussions that you're having, with other folks, in town in Washington, D.C. This is obviously a big issue when it comes to cybersecurity. How will the government approach cybersecurity given the private sector breaches and quite frankly, the campaign breaches? Now, I know there's some efforts by one of your friends is working on an effort right now, Matt Rhodes, and working, he's a Republican, but he's working with Hillary Clinton's a former campaign manager to try to work on this. But what are you hearing on the street right now about what efforts in the government, in the campaigns are being taken to ensure that the Russians don't break in to them?
Well, obviously, this is a huge issue, and you mentioned Matt Rhodes, who was Mitt Romney's campaign manager, is working with Robbie Mook, who was Hillary Clinton's campaign manager, to try to figure out how in the campaign world you can better approach the issue of cybersecurity. I mean, ultimately, large companies like Google and others, they're incentivized to make sure their products are safe, right? If people don't believe their products are safe or going to be able to, and they're not secure, that's ultimately going to impact them and their bottom line. Now, obviously, there's a whole discussion now. Facebook, Amazon, Google, others, do they have monopoly levels of control over some of these industries? A great piece in the Wall Street Journal today that gets into that a bit. But I think that ultimately, government can only do so much, right? And I think the companies are going to have to get there themselves. Now, obviously, how it works and how we do it, I'm not 100% sure on that.
Well,
but there has to be a solution coming from these companies, or else in the marketplace is going to punish them for it.
And let me just use that as a jumping off point to talk about Silicon Valley and tech, the tech world, who seems to have absolutely zero understanding about how Washington works. Now, for those of you out there on the left coast, I wish I was on the left coast with you and not here in a very frigid Washington, D.C., but for the most part, it's a different world. There's a different thought process. And when you have these tech executives come here, when they open up shops in town, they seem to be a little bit befuddled, I guess, for lack of a better term, about how Washington works.
Yeah, and I'm just going to jump in on that. I think the one thing we see, because we do work in the tech space, is it's much different in Silicon Valley. It's a little more idealistic. You have a lot more engineers out there. In Silicon Valley, 1 + 1 always equals 2, and in Washington, D.C., sometimes you can't even understand what the equation is, right? So I think there's a belief sometimes with some of these folks when they come here that just based on their ideas and their products and who they are, that they're going to get things done. But there really has to be a whole little different level of investment and engagement.
Congressman, let's jump right back into the raw politics right now. We're going to talk about gerrymandering. Now, if you're driving in your car, please do not close your eyes and glaze over and crash, okay? Because that's a very big word for basically that says Democrats and Republicans get together in cahoots. They create a congressional map that benefits each other. Now, in some states, that doesn't necessarily happen, and we've seen a lot of court action. In fact, North Carolina there was a ruling down there that their congressional map was unconstitutional. But let me ask you this about gerrymandering, because you were in Congress for many years. How has gerrymandering impacted this division that we're seeing in the country and in the Congress?
Let me give you an example. In the state of Pennsylvania, you'll probably be hearing the same thing about our state, or the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. You've heard in North Carolina. We're the other case. They've got a district down just outside of Philadelphia. They call it Goofy Kicking Donald. And it literally is shaped like the cartoon character Goofy from the Disney, kind of kicking Donald Duck. There's a little section that would be a foot that connects these two areas. Some say it's like a funky earpiece, but what ends up happening is they draw these districts, and both parties do it, to the point where they can gain whatever they can positively. And in Pennsylvania, it worked great. We had 1 million more registered Democrats in Pennsylvania than we have Republicans. Yet when they got finished, because the Republicans controlled the drawing of the congressional districts, there are 13 Democratic members of Congress and 5 Democrats. Again, 1 million more Democrats, but we're losing 13-5 in representation.
Yeah,
so you're able to take those Democrats, and you pile them in, mostly because Democrats tend to live in urban areas. You pile all of them into these districts, and you find these other pockets like State College, where Penn State is, and you divide those up, and you draw the districts so that you can have a Republican district. And the Democrats do it
as well,
similarly, when they have the opportunity as well. And so there's a huge effort now by both Democrats and Republicans to say, let's do this correct, so we don't have to go through this all the time, and try to come up with a fair way to do it. And what ends up happening, my district happened to be when I was in Congress, was the 4th congressional district. It was spread out, but it was fairly contiguous. It ran along the Pennsylvania Turnpike from the Ohio and West Virginia line, west, north, and east of Pittsburgh. Very serviceable. It was fairly even as far as Republicans and Democrats. In fact, when I lost the Senate race in 2000, I was replaced by a Republican. Mm-hmm. You had to be, I was, but you really had to serve that district to be moderate. Mm-hmm. It was as important to me what the Republicans and the independents thought, because I had a good number of them voting for me as well. What ends up happening under gerrymandering is, that it's a safe Democratic seat, or it's a safe Republican seat, and so the Republican Party goes farther to the right, the Democrat Party goes more to the left, and you have fewer people in the middle who, like the old Blue Dog Democrats, they were decimated, and there are just not many of them left anymore.
Right, there's less than 4 or 5, right?
Right.
I think at this point. And the Blue Dog Democrats, for our audience members as well as our listeners on SiriusXM POTUS 124, they are the centrist, moderate Democrats that would often work with Republicans depending on the issue. We're just going to hopscotch and jump around here, but this is for you, Stefan. A lot of criticism about public polling. What stock will, now this is a question from the audience, and it's not me, I'm sorry, it's not me. What stock will be put in polls in 2018 given the inaccuracies in the last election? Let me just say, there really weren't inaccuracies in the last election on national polls. There were on state polls.
That is correct. The national polls were actually quite
spot on.
Quite spot on. Just got the winner just a little bit wrong. Actually, on the national polls, it was about right. It was the state polls that were problematic, and and certainly, no, I'm not going to sit here and be like, oh, polling is perfect. But polling is like every other type of industry or type of job that you're doing. If you take the time to do it right, you do the craft correctly, you're gonna get good results. And what we have happening more and more is what we generally fly-by-night polling, cheap polling that a lot of times you're getting from like local newspapers, radio programs, things like that, who don't have big budgets to run these things, so they kind of do it on the cheap. And if you do it on the cheap, you tend to get bad results. And and then things were missed in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania. People were reading the tea leaves wrong in in Florida. But but I can't just point the finger at the sort of the public polling, because clearly the campaigns had it wrong too, or Clinton would have spent a little bit of time in Wisconsin and Michigan before the last week of the election. So I would say, just like with everything, don't take any one individual poll as this is the gold standard. Right. Only look at this poll. Look at what you're seeing across the board. What's the trend, right? If every poll has one candidate up, it's very likely that candidate's going to win. Don't worry about is it up 3, up 5, up 7, whatever that number is less important than what are you seeing across the board. But be a little careful. Look who's paying for the poll. Look who's putting the numbers out there. Do they have an agenda? Is it a credible organization that's doing this? And if the answers are generally yes, then I think you can put some pretty good stock in there.
A couple questions here. I'm going to pick off and then open it up for discussion here. A couple questions from the audience. First question is, the Defense Secretary Mattis has been invisible. What does that mean for defense policy and foreign policy? I'm actually going to absolutely disagree with that, in the sense that General Mattis is very much involved and very much in tune on what's going on, not only in the White House, but also around the world. I happen to have met him several different times. He's a very delightful person, but what's really important about Jim Mattis is that he is beloved by by the folks who served under him when he was an active Marine general. So while you don't see a whole lot of Jim Mattis out there doing press, he is not somebody who likes the spotlight necessarily. He is somebody who very much is in tune, and I, for one, am actually kind of glad that he is the defense secretary. The second question is, do you think and by the way, if that was your question, you can come up and punch me after the program. That's totally fine. Do you think the lies of President Trump is doing more to enrage for change or turn off populist politics? This is a question I think that I'll take it and then just kind of open it up for the panel to kind of all weigh in. And it's astounding to me, and I've gotten to the point personally where I no longer care if the president is not telling the truth, because it is so blatant that that he's not telling the truth. What really frustrates me is the folks who are saying that it's okay, and there are a lot of them. But I think that there is a reason for that, and I'm going to open it up for the panel about why people are willing to back the president, not politically, but when he makes generalizations or when he makes certain comments that are just out of bounds at best. But let me throw this to the congressman first. Congressman, of course, you represented Pennsylvania. You represented a very diverse district in terms of Republicans and Democrats. Why do people think it's okay for President Trump to not tell the truth?
The old saying is, when the only tool you have is a hammer, you treat all problems like nails. For 24 years, I was a news person. And so when I got to Congress, I didn't change. And when I was a member during the Clinton administration, there were a lot of issues that I had problems with the Clinton administration, and I took them on, and sometimes in a very public way. I don't understand it. I really don't. I don't understand how you can be complacent about these things when they go against you. I don't understand how one day or 1 month you can say everything negative about somebody, and you can call them to account, and then all of a sudden you change your mind and it's okay. And it happens. And some of the people who are doing it, I would conclude, are friends of mine. I'm very disappointed in it. Both Republicans and Democrats, primarily the Republicans, because they're running the show. I think it falls upon all of us to hold our own party to account. If the president is not being truthful, if he's not governing correctly, if he's tweeting things that are harmful to the country, and the Republicans don't hold him to account, they are weakening their own party. And believe it or not, I'm one Democrat that likes to see a strong Republican Party, because when the two parties are both strong, it holds us both to account. And I wish that they would buck up and do a much better job of holding them to account.
Stefan, let me throw it to you. Take off your Democrat hat if you can, and go right into your data analytic hat. I mean, you were talking about some of the demographics earlier in the program, but why do you think that some people are giving the president a pass when it comes to lying?
I would say, and I don't know if this is necessarily answering this from a data perspective, but it seems my take is that Republicans in Congress have made a decision that getting some of their policies passed is more important than calling the president to account. And what I think, taking it half a step back, we talked about some of the problems that the Republican coalition is having. Democrats have the same kinds of problems. We're just not in charge right now, so we don't talk about it as much. But it's right below the surface. But what really seems to be happening, in our opinion, is that the parties are realigning. And the sort of what was the Republican Party, what was the Democratic Party, is unlikely to be holding together. I mean, originally I said in the next 8 to 10 years, but now I think Trump is actually accelerating this. And I think even by 2020, you might be seeing the parties like falling apart, basically. Now, where it's heading, I think, is actually a dangerous place for the country of the coalitions that seem to be forming. But what you have, I think, are people sort of trying to hold on to what is the Republican Party and sort of not quite realizing that the ship has kind of sailed. And again, the same thing on the Democratic side, that there are people sort of holding on to an ideal of a party that's not, it's there kind of almost in name only, and these coalitions are breaking apart, and that's causing a lot of this, people not acting the way they really should be.
Hey, Brian, we're running up against a break right now, but in about 30 seconds or so, can you explain how you can... No, I'm kidding. But we are running up against a break. But I am interested in... Nobody laughed at that? Good Lord. Could you explain how detrimental this is to some Republican candidates? Because it's not going to hurt all Republican candidates running in 2018, but how detrimental is it that they have to answer for President Trump's comments?
Well, it's problematic in a couple of different ways. First off, you have primaries. And in primaries, you're going to have to bank hard to the right. You're going to have questions being asked about Trump in all of these different positions and statements. And if you don't answer them correctly, you're not going to emerge from the primary. If you answer them correctly, it might be fine for the primary, but in the general election, it could just be poison. So I think Republicans are going to be twisted in many different directions. And as Stefan said, you have this changing electorate you have to deal with. And it's going to be very, very challenging, I think, for a lot of Republicans, particularly in these swing districts.
And you are listening to Full Stop with Mark Preston here on Sirius XM POTUS 124. We're talking about 2018, an outlook here in Washington, D.C., both when it comes to policy and politics. Much more to come. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Come back to the middle. Yeah, which is how you win a general.
And welcome back to Full Stop with Mark Preston here on Sirius XM POTUS 124, a very special one, surrounded by the University of Massachusetts. Can we hear a little bit of that at Amherst? Talking about 2018 politics in policy. Here's a good question. I don't really know how to answer it, so I'm going to punt it to somebody else on the panel. A question from the audience. As a public policy student who wants to have an impact, why should I work in D.C. and not at the state or local level? I mean, I would tell you to go to Miami because it is a lot warmer. But let's just go down the line. I want all three of you to answer this question. If you can, just kind of keep your answers short. But Stefan first, why would you want to come to Washington, D.C. or instead of working at the state or local level, or should they stay at the state or local level?
I think there's a strong argument for staying at the state and local level. It's where more is happening at the state level than what's happening in Washington. And I mean, it's been that way for years. I mean, we talked about they can't even pass the transportation bill anymore. So, most of the more dramatic policy changes are happening at the state level. So look, if you like a challenge, you like to solve problems of things not getting done, DC's your place. If you actually want to try to move things forward, states might not be the worst place to look.
Brian?
Yeah, I might disagree a little bit. I mean, I think I agree that state and local is where it's happening on the policy from a policy perspective. But I do think here in D.C., in terms of think tanks, nonprofits, there are other entities here that are making a difference, and they also do wind up influencing what's happening in the government. And there's little battles that happen every day and little pieces of legislation that people never read about. And so I think that there are small victories still occurring. They're just not quite as visible, and it's more challenging.
Congressman Klink?
I have the great distinction of being able to represent Governor Wolf here in Washington, D.C. So I get to do some things back in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and I get to do some things here in Washington, D.C. And they're really, you're right, they are two different worlds. It depends, I think, on what your calling is. Some people are not going to be happy at a state capitol. you're going to really feel that you want to take on things that are more national, and you're going to feel that calling, so you can come down here. And don't get overwhelmed by Washington, D.C. I always tell when our clients first come to town, just remember, there's 435 families on one side of the hill, there's 100 on the other, and the big boss is at 1,600. Your reputation in this town is made between those people, the staffers in those offices and those members. And you really do have a chance if you are able to make friends and get to know people and get to know issues and you're respected, to have an impact in a very small area, Washington, D.C., on issues that are huge and really global. So if that's your calling and you really feel good about it, that's good. But you can get more done quicker at a state level.
Let's go to the Me Too movement here in Washington, D.C., and let's talk about women candidates. Now, at Rutgers University, a fine state university, not as fine as the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, has a center there called the Center for American Women in Politics. They say that there are about 394 women who are running or potentially running for Congress. Now, I should note, at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, they have a program called the UMass Women into Leadership Program, where they take young women and help, I guess, weave them into the process, for lack of a better term, when it comes to politics and policy and in government, as well as business. So I think we're starting to see this across the country, and I'm happy to see it at my alma mater. But when we're talking about women running for Congress, Stefan, when you look at that, has the Me Too movement really accelerated that? The idea that women say that they want to take back what they lost or what they never had in a male-dominated industry, and that would be politics.
I mean, I think the Me Too accelerated what was already happening right after the election. I mean, we saw it with the march in Washington and other cities right after the inauguration, so we're just about to hit the 1 year. Can't believe it's only been a year.
Right. It feels about 10,
longest
right?
year ever.
Right.
And we saw a really high level of engagement among women across the country. I mean, I remember we did a survey in Massachusetts among the women who participated in the march in Boston, and the level of people who were talking about how they were changing their donation habits, how the likelihood of them running for office was just staggering to see. And that started to dip a little bit as we kind of got into the sort of early summer. I think just sort of a natural, you can kind of keep anger only going for so long, and Trump wasn't really doing a ton to really piss people off for a little while. Didn't last long. But then we saw an upswing, and then the Me Too movement sort of was born, or became a national topic, and then it shot right back up again. So I wouldn't say it was a Me Too movement like specifically, but it was Me Too sort of coming on the sort of on the back's not the right way to say it, but like came after what was already happening after the election and the inauguration of the president.
And Brian, it's not just Democratic women are running. There are a lot of Republican women that are running as well. What are you seeing on your side?
All these races are going to come down to candidates, right? And you can talk about the overall environment in the election. You can talk about the generic ballot, but it's candidates who ultimately matter. And
you're talking about the personality, their work ethic,
sure, who are these
their
individuals?
positions?
Who are they?
Right.
What have they done before? Where are they? And it's about a choice, right? So I think that you are seeing a lot of women, obviously on the Democratic side and the Republican side too. But I think that, as we were talking about before, I'm sure you see this with your races. You can talk about what the generic ballot is, but you have to get inside each of these races and who the individuals are. Now, if there's a wave election, then things could be a little different. But candidates matter.
This actually happened before. You mentioned I ran in 1992. Mm-hmm. For those that are old enough to remember, that was called the Year of the Woman.
Right.
Because it was right after Justice Clarence Thomas was they had the hearings for him to become a Supreme Court justice, and a law professor, Anita Hill, made accusations that he had done some inappropriate things, and there were days and days of testimony, and a lot of women and men across America were so incensed by what they heard that women were motivated and ran in record numbers in 1992, and I think that continued. But I think this is another extension of this is like supercharging that same feeling again.
So we just have a couple minutes left here in the program, literally 2 or 3 minutes left. So we're going to try to speed round this as well. Democrats will be in the same position that Republicans were in 2015, 2016, when we get to 2020. And when I say that, they had 17 Republican candidates. Republicans did back in 2015, 2016. We could see that number increase with Democrats as well. There are a lot of people looking at running. So, Stefan, as we shoot down the line, ask you to keep your answers fairly short here. But what type of candidate do you think is best for the Democrats in 2020? Okay, who are you working for right now?
No, we're not working for anyone. I mean, so I think honestly, it's about, we need to win, right? So it's like, give me the boring Southern white guy who can not piss off people in states like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, and that we need to win back. I mean, that's ultimately not where the party's going, but that's we need the win.
Brian, who do Republicans not want to see run from the Democratic side in 2020?
Kamala Harris. I think she scares a lot of people. Right. California, Silicon Valley money,
former
law
enforcement
general. Background, multiracial. I think a woman. I think she seems formidable on paper.
Congressman, when you're talking to folks in the industry, but also your friends on Capitol Hill, what's the chatter that you're hearing up there, and who would you like to see run in 2020?
Well, I think it is wide open. I've not supported anyone. I don't know who's going to run yet, but I think that we want somebody who's not named Clinton to run. That would be a good move.
Well, I think the Clintons don't like to hear that.
And I think that we also need some fresh blood. And whether it's Kamala Harris or whether it's could be Senator Booker, could be anyone. But there are a lot of people. We within the Democratic Party are really in need of a youth movement. And that's not only presidential candidates, but that's also our leadership in the House of Representatives. We need somebody to lead the party, or a group of people to lead the party who are not in their mid to late 70s. We need to find people.
You would like to see, for instance, perhaps House Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi to step aside?
I think it'd be a great thing for her. She's done wonderful work. She's a dear friend of mine. But I think that, and the same thing goes with Steny Hoyer, Jim Clyburn. Mr. Clyburn and I came in together. I think at a certain point in time, it's up to them not to necessarily leave Congress, but to step aside and let some of the youth and enthusiasts, let's start to grow the party a little bit. And the same thing goes for chairmanship. Mm-hmm. You can't have people sitting around waiting 20, 25 years to be a committee chairman in Washington, D.C. That's one of the things the Republicans did that really led to a youth movement in the party. And if you take a look at the leadership of the two parties, there's a great contrast. We're the Geritol for lunch bunch, and they're the youthful-looking people. So it's time that the Democrats catch on. Okay, we have one last question from the audience, and we have literally seconds for this one, so we're going to have to just go down the line very quickly. We'll leave it on a nice note. In a bipartisan manner, what's the biggest area that Republicans and Democrats can work on in 2018 and succeed? Stefan.
If they could actually get a transportation bill going, I think that's the one thing that they could actually work on together.
Brian?
Early childhood education.
Infrastructure. We have to rebuild America. It's crumbling. It's going to put people to work, and it's going. And when you do that, you're going to be raising more tax dollars based upon the fact that America is working and moving again. And you were listening to a special edition of, what's the name of my show? A Full Stop with Mark Preston here on Sirius XM POTUS 124. That's all we have for the hour. I want to say thank you to former Congressman Ron Klink for hosting us here and for providing some insight on the panel here in his offices at the Nelson Mullins, Riley, and Scarborough's Washington, D.C. office. Stefan Hankin’, who's the founder and president of Lincoln Park Strategies, a Democratic polling firm and political consultancy firm, and Brian Jones, who is a Republican and a partner at the BlackRock Group. Thank you all for coming here and providing this insight today.
Thanks. Thank you.
And that's all we have for this edition of Full Stop with Mark Preston. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, feel free to drop me a line at fullstopwithmarkpreston@gmail.com. Of course, you can always find me on Twitter and Facebook and on CNN. If you have any questions about the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, I suggest that you take a look into it. You can find it on the web at umass.edu. And a quick quick special thanks to a couple people for making this program happen. I want to thank Christie Ways as well for all her work in putting together this program. I'd also like to thank John Hurd as well for his leadership as the Dean of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, and Joseph Donovan, who works alongside Congressman Klink and is an alumnus of 1993 from UMass Amherst. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you next week.